Every empire leaves ruins. Some leave broken walls, charred manuscripts, and forgotten names. Others leave monuments that resist centuries, stone towers and carved pillars that seem to defy time itself. Yet there is a different kind of inheritance, one far harder to trace. It leaves no battlefield ruins, no inscriptions of conquest. It is passed silently, carried not in treasure chests or archives, but in the veins of those who inherit it. A memory coded into lineage, a bloodline that becomes its own archive. The story of the Knights Templar is often told as one of warriors and bankers, of crusades and conspiracies. But hidden behind the familiar accounts lies something different, something quieter, more elusive. It is the suggestion that what the Templars guarded most carefully was not gold, not relics, not even sacred texts. It was blood, a line of descent that some believed stretched back to ancient kings, to biblical patriarchs, perhaps even to the Nazarene himself. If true, this inheritance would have been far more dangerous than any sword or fortress. For a king can be dethroned, a pope exiled, a nation conquered. But blood, if preserved carefully enough, moves invisibly across centuries. The traces of this idea linger in fragments, in half-erased manuscripts, in cryptic marginalia on monastery pages, in the odd persistence of names that resurface generation after generation in unexpected places. No historian has found an unbroken genealogy proving the case. And yet the absence of proof seems almost intentional, as if silence itself was part of the design. To understand why such a notion has persisted, one must return to a city whose very stones hold more memory than most empires: Jerusalem. The 12th century was a time of unending struggle for the city, as crusaders and Islamic dynasties contested its walls. Yet beneath the clamour of swords and prayers, another current stirred. It is said that when the first 9 knights established themselves on the Temple Mount, they did not live in ordinary quarters. Their residence was set within the ruins of Solomon's temple itself, in chambers that had been sealed and abandoned for centuries. Archaeological surveys in modern times have confirmed that a labyrinth of crypts, passages, and subterranean halls still lies beneath the mount, many unexplored and some deliberately sealed. It was here, according to scattered accounts, that something was discovered, or perhaps remembered. Some Cistercian chronicles, written in the same circles that helped draft the Templar rule, make vague reference to familiae reservati, the reserved families. These were not donors or noble patrons in the usual sense. They were described as households bound by sanguinis memoria, memory of the blood. Their names were never openly listed, but the implication is clear. A circle within the circle of the order, families sworn not merely to military defense or financial stewardship, but to the preservation of a lineage. Legends from southern France speak of a night ceremony held in Jerusalem before dawn, when the knights swore not only their famous vows of poverty and chastity, but another vow never recorded in the Vatican archives. In that rite, a child is said to have been presented, nameless, without title, but carrying blood thought to descend from lines long erased from official chronicles. The knights swore to guard him as if he were both relic and revelation, not a possession, but a living memory. Whether this legend holds truth or was a later embellishment cannot be known, but centuries afterward, when Rosslyn Chapel was carved in Scotland, symbols of Judea appeared woven into its very stones with a precision that defies coincidence. Bees, stars, and geometric motifs that had no place in Christian iconography still found their way into the structure, as though the chapel itself was meant to be a vessel of memory, a memory that began not in Europe but in the underground chambers of Jerusalem. If this was indeed the true secret, then the question arises, Why would the Pope grant such extraordinary privileges to a handful of poor knights with no noble heritage? Why allow them to stand above both church and crown, immune to local law, answerable only to the pontiff himself? The official story is their loyalty and protection of pilgrims. Yet papal bulls granting sweeping authority to men with no titles, no estates, no dynastic claims suggest something deeper. A trust rooted not in arms but in something untouchable. Blood has always been more than biology. Across cultures, it is the vessel of legitimacy, the invisible crown that gives weight to rulers and dynasties. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs claimed descent from the gods themselves. In Israel, kings traced their lines back to David. In Rome, emperors often adopted or married into lines that lent them sacred legitimacy. If the Templars truly guarded a bloodline, then their power was not their own. It was borrowed from something kings and popes alike both coveted and feared. The story begins then not with armies on the battlefield, but with oaths whispered in stone chambers, oaths not written down, not confessed to inquisitors, not erased by royal decrees, oaths that could survive fire, exile, and persecution because they were encrypted not in parchment but in flesh and bone. And so, while chronicles describe knights in white cloaks marked with the red cross, behind that visible order there may have been another, quieter, unseen. A current within the current. A secret order within the order, whose members did not merely fight for Christendom, but carried the guardianship of something older, something so dangerous it could never be named aloud. History teaches us that armies fall, castles crumble, and fortunes vanish. But a bloodline, if preserved with patience, endures. It can move silently across borders, hidden behind new surnames, concealed within marriage alliances, resurfacing in advisors, treasurers, scholars, and courtiers. It does not need to raise a flag or proclaim its presence. It needs only to survive, unseen yet always near the centers of power. In this way, the Templar legacy may not have vanished when their order was destroyed in 1307. Their fortresses were seized, their archives burned, their knights executed. But blood requires no fortress, no archive, no name. It flows quietly, generation after generation, carrying with it memory that no fire can consume. If this is the true inheritance of the Templars, then their story was never really about the Holy Land or about treasure buried beneath cathedrals. It was about survival through the one medium that cannot be seized, lineage. And it is in the veins of families forgotten by official history, in symbols carved discreetly into chapel ceilings, in genealogies that never see the light of day, that the legacy continues. The chronicles of kings and popes may dismiss them as a dissolved order, a relic of crusading zeal. But if we listen more carefully beneath the surface of official history, there is another rhythm. Not the clash of swords or the ringing of coins, but the quiet pulse of something carried silently, patiently, through time. And it is here, at this starting point in Jerusalem, that the question begins. Was the Templar power ever really about knights and castles? Or was it always about blood, a forbidden inheritance that no empire could afford to let fall into the wrong hands? Jerusalem, where blood and memory began. Jerusalem has been described as the navel of the world, the meeting point of heaven and earth, where stone walls carry centuries of prayer, blood, and prophecy. To empires it was a prize, to prophets it was a vision, to armies it was a fortress. But to the Templars, Jerusalem was more than all of these. It was a threshold, a place where blood and memory intertwined, and where their true purpose may have been first set in motion. When the Crusaders captured the city in 1099, they walked into streets that had already been layered with millennia of sacred claims. Under Roman ruins lay traces of Herod's temple, and beneath those, whispers of Solomon's great sanctuary, itself built upon older Canaanite shrines. Archaeologists in modern times have uncovered pottery, inscriptions, and sealed crypts deep beneath the Temple Mount, revealing a palimpsest of civilizations: Babylonian, Jewish, Greek, Roman, Islamic, all written over one another like lines in a manuscript. It was here that the first 9 Templar Knights established their home, calling themselves Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templic Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. To most, this sounded like a gesture of humility. 9 knights with no great estates offering their service to protect pilgrims on the road. Yet their chosen residence was not accidental. Living on the very ground of Solomon's temple meant inhabiting a space already thick with legend. Jewish tradition spoke of the Ark of the Covenant once resting here, a chest not merely of stone tablets but of divine power. Islamic tradition believed the Prophet ascended to heaven from this mount. Christian mystics saw it as the place where Christ overturned the tables of money changers, declaring a higher authority than empire or priesthood. To live here was not just to guard pilgrims, it was to step into a corridor of memory stretching back to the dawn of kingship. Some medieval chroniclers hint at excavations conducted by the early Templars beneath the mount. Fragments of notes preserved in European monastic archives describe vaults broken open and chambers beneath the stone. Whether these were real archaeological efforts or later legend is unknown, but what matters is what people believed. The idea spread that the Templars had found something more than relics. Some whispered of manuscripts hidden away since Babylonian conquest, others of genealogical records charting lines of descent claimed to reach back to David or beyond. One Cistercian monk, writing in the early 12th century, referred to the linea sacra, the sacred line. He did not explain what it was, but placed it in the context of the Templars' role as guardians not only of pilgrims, but of a greater mystery hidden in the blood of chosen families. His manuscript, now incomplete, was copied and recopied, with marginal symbols added over time, intersecting triangles, circles within squares, and sigils later recognized as early esoteric marks. The text never explicitly names what was found, yet the silence around it speaks louder than any detailed account. Jerusalem in the 12th century was more than battlefield. It was a school of silence. The Templars did not only learn swordplay here, they learned discretion, secrecy, and the art of guarding without declaring. In a city where Jews, Christians, and Muslims all laid claim to the same stones, truth was already divided into layers. Each community held its own version, its own memory, its own sacred bloodlines. The Templars, by living within this contested space, absorbed the understanding that power often lies not in proclaiming memory, but in guarding it from proclamation. Legends from Provence and Languedoc, the later heartlands of Templar sympathy, speak of emissaries arriving from the east, carrying genealogical charts unlike any preserved in European churches. Some linked the Nazarene not merely to prophecy but to dynastic survival, suggesting that his line was not extinguished but dispersed. Whether true or myth, the suggestion was enough to elevate the role of the Templars beyond warriors. If they were guardians of blood, then they were not simply protectors of the Holy Land. They were protectors of legitimacy itself, of a right to rule that no pope or king could bestow, only inherit. This idea begins to explain the paradox. Why would the papacy, wary of secular knights and jealous of its own authority, grant this small group powers that rivaled kings? Exemption from taxes, immunity from local law, the right to build their own chapels, and authority to cross borders unchecked. To the Church, such privileges were not given lightly. Yet the Templars received them within 2 decades of their founding. It suggests that their role was not merely useful, but indispensable, perhaps because they carried or had discovered something that made both Pope and Crown reluctant to oppose them openly. In later centuries, symbols began to appear that seemed to trace back to these first years in Jerusalem. The tilted cross carved into Templar commanderies, the five-pointed star placed discreetly in manuscripts, the bee emblem of sacred kingship in Merovingian law carved in places far from France. Even Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built centuries after, bore carvings of pomegranates, stars of David, and Eastern flora unknown in Northern Europe. Each appears as if a fragment of Jerusalem had been carried westward and hidden in stone, and always at the center, the whisper of bloodlines. Not the blood spilled on battlefields, but blood preserved, guarded, and transmitted through marriages, alliances, and silent vows. The Templars were poor knights in name, but behind them families quietly grew wealthy, not by chance, but by association. Some chronicles refer to fratres non notati, the brothers not marked, men never wearing the cloak, never riding to war, yet bound to the order through kinship. They became bishops, scribes, treasurers. They left fewer records, but their children intermarried with nobility, weaving a network no fortress could contain. When the persecution of 1307 came, many Templars were burned, tortured, and erased from memory. Yet blood cannot be erased in fire. In France, Portugal, Scotland, and Spain, families suddenly rose into prominence without clear origin. Their estates once belonged to the order. Their sons married into royal houses. Their names, Sinclair, Neville, d'Albera, de Guizot, appear like threads tying Jerusalem's legacy to Europe's future. Thus, Jerusalem was not only the birthplace of the order in 1119, it was the place where their secret may have taken root. The oaths made beneath the temple were never written in papal bulls. They were carved instead into veins and memory, binding the Templars to something beyond Christendom's wars. A duty not proclaimed, but inherited. And so, while empires fought over the holy city, while minarets and cathedrals rose and fell, another continuity began in silence, a current flowing not through armies or decrees, but through bloodlines unseen yet unbroken. This is why Jerusalem remains the true axis of the Templar story. Not for the relics they may have uncovered, not for the treasures they are said to have buried, but because it was here that guardianship shifted from sword to blood, from fortresses to families. History remembers kings, popes, and generals. Yet beneath their chronicles runs another record, one never officially written. The record of memory carried through descent, of vows whispered in crypts, of secrets preserved not for victory, but for survival. That record begins in Jerusalem. And though centuries have passed, its echo still lingers in symbols, names, and families that quietly shaped the world long after the order itself was declared dead, the circle within the circle. Every institution has two faces. The first is the one presented to the world, visible, structured, recorded. The second is hidden, quieter, and more difficult to trace. The Templars were no exception. To most of Europe, they were warriors in white mantles, guardians of pilgrims, bankers of kings, and servants of the papacy. Their rules, written and approved, outlined lives of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But behind those codified laws, another current flowed, a current that did not appear in charters, that was not proclaimed in councils, and that was never confessed even under torture. A circle within the circle. The hints of this hidden stratum come not from proclamations, but from fragments, scattered notes, suggestive symbols, and genealogical patterns that repeat too often to be coincidence. Certain chronicles refer to familiae reservati, reserved families, bound to the order not by land donations or knightly service, but by blood. These were the ones who, even when stripped of title, still held memory. Their presence was discreet, almost invisible, but essential. They were not listed among the knights, yet without them, the deeper vows could not survive. The outer circle was what Europe saw: crusaders riding to battle, treasurers lending coin, and commanders defending fortresses. The inner circle was different. It gathered not in castles, but in crypt-like chambers beneath chapels. Accounts from inquisitors, though often clouded by political motives, mention ceremonies by candlelight where symbols were carved into stone. Marks not quite Christian, not fully pagan, yet echoing sacred geometry found in ancient traditions. Circles within squares, stars intersected with crosses, twin pillars inscribed with numbers. The initiated would kneel not before an altar of gold, but before a pattern of light projected through a carved opening, striking a precise spot on the chamber floor at certain times of year. Rituals of this kind echo far older traditions. In Egypt, light was used to mark solstices in temples. In Greece, Shiites of the Eleusinian mysteries swore oaths of silence within torch-lit halls. In Jewish mysticism, the arrangement of letters in sacred texts was believed to carry hidden power. The Templars, dwelling in Jerusalem's crypts and surrounded by centuries of layered faiths, seem to have absorbed these traditions and recoded them into their own hidden ceremonies. Those admitted to this inner circle were not chosen randomly. They were often the sons of families that had given the order not only wealth, but descendants. Blood itself was a key. In the genealogies of families later tied to the Templars, Sinclairs in Scotland, de Gisors in France, d'Alboras in Spain, subtle signs appear. Names repeated in generations at exact intervals, marriages arranged across borders, offspring placed in clerical or financial roles rather than on the battlefield. These were not simply noble lineages, they were conduits. In the quiet of these hidden chambers, vows were spoken that bound not only the knight, but his descendants. One such vow, whispered in fragments of Latin recorded by hostile chroniclers, declared "Memoria non peribit." Memory shall not perish. It was not about lands, castles, or relics. It was about remembrance passed down like an inheritance, one that no enemy could seize. Symbols carved into chapel ceilings, particularly in Languedoc and the Pyrenees, confirmed that something unusual was being guarded. Among ordinary Christian crosses appear crescents, bees, and stars, motifs later associated with Merovingian kings and ancient Judean dynasties. Scholars debate whether these were heretical borrowings or coded reminders of bloodlines. Whatever their origin, their persistence across regions suggests deliberate continuity. The inner circle was not vast. It could not be, for secrecy demanded limitation. The phrase ordo interioris, the inner order, appears in one 14th century monastic record describing brothers whose names are not written, yet whose vows are never broken. This order within the order seemed to operate like an invisible spine. The outer knights fought wars and guarded treasure, while the inner circle preserved the one thing more precious than either: legitimacy by blood. The survival of this hidden group can be glimpsed during the persecution of 1307. Thousands of knights were arrested across France, accused of heresy and idolatry. Many were executed, others tortured, their confessions forced and contradictory. Yet what is striking is this: not one confession ever revealed the existence of a bloodline oath. Not one detailed the names of reserved families or the vows spoken in hidden chambers. Either such an oath never existed, or it was protected by a silence so absolute it could outlast fire and torture. In fact, silence itself seems to have been the strategy. When kings and popes hunted the order, the visible structure collapsed. Castles were seized, coffers emptied, commanderies dissolved. Yet within a generation, the surnames associated with the inner circle began to surface again in new roles. They were no longer knights, they were advisors, treasurers, bishops, and merchants. Their children intermarried with ruling houses, not loudly, but consistently. The bloodline flowed forward, unbroken, like a river passing underground. One cannot miss the parallel to other secret traditions of history. In Jewish Kabbalah, sacred knowledge was transmitted not in writing but through chosen families, guarded like light passed from one lamp to another. In Sufi mysticism, memory of the divine was carried in chains of initiation, each disciple linked by trust and blood to the previous. In Christian Gnosticism, texts were hidden, but the true message was said to live in the blood of the chosen. The Templars, standing at the crossroads of all these traditions in the Holy Land, seem to have learned the same principle, that what cannot be written cannot be burned, and what is carried in lineage cannot be erased. The circle within the circle became, in effect, a hidden archive, not of documents, not of relics, but of memory embodied in descendants. Those descendants could change names, move across borders, even serve crowns or churches that once condemned their fathers. But the essence of their vow survived, invisible to ordinary eyes. In monasteries of Languedoc and in remote valleys of the Pyrenees, rumours persisted for centuries of secluded communities that admitted only those of certain descent. Their names never appeared in royal decrees, but within local chronicles, small notes remain, references to custodes sanguinis, guardians of the blood. They lived outwardly as monks or minor nobles, but their true role was silent preservation. Thus the Templar order was never simply destroyed. The outer shell was shattered, but the inner circle slipped into silence. They no longer needed fortresses or battle standards. Their sanctuary was lineage, their fortress was memory, their treasury was blood. And so history remembers the Templars as an order dissolved by fire and decree. But in truth, a fragment of them remained, an unseen circle within the circle, holding vows that would echo long after their cloaks were burned. Their true treasure was never lost because it was never stored in vaults. It was stored in veins, the reserved families. When a great order collapses, its memory often falls into ruins with it. Temples are torn down, manuscripts burned, names erased. Yet sometimes survival takes a different form, not through armies or institutions, but through families, quiet, patient, invisible to official chronicles, yet carrying within them something that cannot be destroyed: blood. Among the Templars there are scattered references in chronicles and inquisitorial records to familiae reservati, the reserved families. These were not knights in white mantles, nor abbots presiding over monasteries. They were households bound to the order in ways deeper than donation or loyalty. Their bond was lineage. Through them, the most silent legacy of the Templars survived. Not castles or treasure, but memory encrypted in descent. The idea of reserved families is difficult to prove, and yet it lingers in too many places to ignore. In the chronicles of Cistercian monks who were close allies of the Templars, there are marginal notes about families who guarded not relics but names. The phrasing suggests genealogical preservation, bloodlines linked to the order, recorded not in royal charters but in coded genealogies kept under lock and key. Across Europe, certain surnames seem to appear again and again in moments when Templar traces resurface. Sinclair in Scotland, Gizos in France, Dalbora in Spain, and Neville and Howard in England. These families did not always rise to kingship, but they consistently stood near the centres of power as treasurers, advisors, patrons, or bishops. Their role was not to lead armies or rule kingdoms. It was subtler, to preserve legitimacy, to hold memory, and to ensure continuity through marriage alliances. In southern France, particularly in Languedoc and the Pyrenees, legends tell of small noble households who welcomed displaced Templars after the persecution of 1307. These households did not vanish after sheltering the order. Instead, they seemed to grow in influence, acquiring estates, marrying into higher ranks, and producing sons who entered church offices and royal councils. Their ascent was quiet, never ostentatious, as if they carried a duty that demanded discretion rather than display. The nature of their role becomes clearer when one considers what the Templars truly possessed. Their treasure, often imagined as gold or relics, was in reality a network. Knowledge, financial systems, sacred symbols, and perhaps most dangerous of all, genealogies. If they did indeed guard a forbidden bloodline, as many legends claim, then the safest way to protect it was not to hoard it in a vault, but to weave it into families that could endure across centuries. Marriage became the new fortress. Sons and daughters of these reserved families entered unions not chosen for love or prestige alone, but for preservation. Lineages with Templar ties intermarried with branches of ruling houses, their children raised not as knights, but as advisors, scribes, and financiers. Outwardly, they were loyal servants of king or church. Inwardly, they were links in a chain stretching back to vows whispered in Jerusalem's crypts. One revealing clue lies in the peculiar repetition of certain symbols in the coats of arms of these families. Bees associated with the Merovingian kings, tilted crosses common in Templar carvings, and twin pillars echoing the biblical Jachin and Boaz. Heraldry was more than decoration. It was a coded language, speaking silently to those who knew how to read it. To ordinary eyes, these were patterns of design. To the initiated, they were reminders of a bond too ancient to declare openly. In monasteries of Aragon, small side chapels contain inscriptions naming donors whose families never appear in wider chronicles, yet their symbols, stars, circles, crescents, match those associated with the Templars. It is as if they lived ordinary, noble lives while carrying extraordinary inheritances, guardians of a secret they could never fully proclaim. The reserved families did not preserve memory in isolation. They formed a network, scattered but connected. Through pilgrim paths, trade routes, and intermarriages, they ensured that bloodlines carrying fragments of Templar memory would never disappear in one place. If one branch was extinguished by war or plague, another survived in a distant land. Like seeds scattered by the wind, the legacy took root wherever soil was safe. Historians puzzled by sudden bursts of wealth in certain European houses have long noted the pattern. Estates appearing without clear inheritance records, families marrying into nobility with no obvious claim, yet accepted without resistance. These anomalies often trace back to regions once thick with Templar commanderies. The implication is subtle but profound. The treasure of the order may not have been gold hidden in vaults, but bloodlines carefully placed into the structures of power. In Scotland, the Sinclairs are remembered as keepers of Rosslyn Chapel, a building so saturated with symbolism it has been called a stone manuscript. Within their genealogy appear mysterious annotations, marks beside certain names, circles and slashes, indicating roles not explained. Some researchers believe these marks identified members considered bloodline keepers, descendants linked by oath to the hidden current of Templar memory. In Portugal, after the order was dissolved, it re-emerged as the Order of Christ, a transformation allowed by the monarchy. Many noble houses that supported the Templars became entwined with this new order, their heirs carrying forward not only estates, but sacred trust. These families later played key roles in exploration and navigation, spreading their influence far beyond Europe. Whether by design or coincidence, the Templar current flowed into the very age that redrew the maps of the world. The reserved families were not grand dynasties in the traditional sense. They rarely wore crowns or commanded armies. Their power lay in something more durable: legitimacy without exposure, continuity without conquest. They could vanish from chronicles, yet remain embedded in society, resurfacing in the margins of history whenever the memory they carried was needed. Thus, while the world believes the Templar Order ended in fire, the truth may be quieter. Its essence survived not in castles or relics, but in families who carried within their veins the memory of vows spoken long ago, families who did not need to announce their role, for their very existence was the preservation of continuity. To trace them is nearly impossible, for their greatest strength was invisibility. But in the repetition of names, in symbols carved in hidden places, and in sudden ascents without explanation, one begins to sense the outline of an inheritance too deliberate to be chance. A legacy not proclaimed, but embodied. A memory not written, but living. And so the Templars, though broken as an institution, endured through the reserved families. In them, the Order's deepest secret remained intact. Not a fortress of stone, but a fortress of blood. Not a relic sealed in a vault, but a lineage moving quietly through time. From warriors to networks. The fall of the Templars in 1307 seemed final. Across France, knights were dragged from their commanderies, their lands seized, their leaders burned at the stake. The world believed the Order had been destroyed. But destruction in history is often an illusion. While the visible structure collapsed, an invisible one was already forming. The swords were gone, but what survived was something far more enduring: networks. The Templars had never been only warriors. Long before their persecution, they had become Europe's most sophisticated administrators of wealth. Pilgrims entrusted them with funds, monarchs borrowed vast sums, and merchants relied on their credit letters. A traveller could deposit coin in Paris and withdraw its equivalent in Jerusalem, a system that foreshadowed the global banking networks of centuries to come. This infrastructure did not vanish when the knights were scattered. It slipped into the hands of families connected to the inner circle, the familiae reservati who had been prepared for this moment. One does not trace this survival through open records, but through patterns. In the decades after the suppression of the Order, obscure financial houses began rising across Europe with astonishing speed. In Flanders, northern Italy and the Rhineland, families such as the Fuggers, the Welsers, and later the Medici appeared seemingly out of nowhere, equipped with financial knowledge far ahead of their peers. Their sudden prominence has long puzzled historians. How could households with no royal lineage establish systems rivaling entire kingdoms? The answer may lie in the inheritance of memory. The Templars had preserved maps of trade routes, coded archives of debts, and trusted relationships with merchants and nobles. When the knights were purged, these assets were not destroyed. They were absorbed into family lineages that had been designated as custodians. Knowledge became heirloom, and bloodlines became banks. Marriage, again, was the mechanism. Daughters of Templar-linked families were wed to merchants in Genoa, Venice, or Augsburg. Sons became advisors to kings or treasurers of cities. Through these unions, the hidden knowledge of the Templar network fused with the ambitions of rising merchant dynasties. Within a generation, wealth that had once flowed through monasteries now coursed through private ledgers. The transition was seamless. To the world, the Templars were gone. In truth, their logic had only changed form. The architecture of these new families mirrored Templar structures. Just as the Order had divided authority into circles, outer knights, commanders, and an inner council, the banking houses developed tiered systems of secrecy. Not all partners knew the full scope of assets. Certain ledgers were encoded, accessible only to senior members bound by oaths of silence. The dual key principle, first used in Templar treasuries where no single knight, could access a vault alone, reappeared in the vaults of early banks in Florence and Basel. Symbols also survived. In the architectural designs of these new financial houses, one finds traces of Templar geometry. Meeting halls aligned with solstice light, vaults shaped as octagons echoing the Templar cross, and coats of arms bearing bees, stars, or twin pillars. These motifs were not random, they were continuity in disguise. To ordinary eyes, decoration. To the initiated, a reminder that the flame had not gone out. Guilds too bore the mark of this inheritance. In the 14th and 15th centuries, trade guilds across Europe adopted organizational models strikingly similar to Templar commanderies. They had initiation rites, coded signs of recognition, and hierarchical degrees of membership. Masons, weavers, and merchants formed brotherhoods that not only regulated trade, but preserved symbols once carved into Templar chapels. The evolution into Freemasonry centuries later would formalize this hidden legacy, but its roots can be seen in these early guilds. What made these networks truly powerful was their resilience. Armies could be defeated, castles besieged, kings dethroned. But networks, woven into families, finances, and symbols, could not be easily destroyed. They adapted, spread, and reappeared under new names. The Church could condemn the Templars as heretics, but it could not uproot the flow of credit. Monarchs could seize castles, but they still needed loans from the very families who had once sheltered the knights. By the 15th century, these networks had grown strong enough to shape the course of nations. The Medici in Florence bankrolled popes and artists alike, financing both the papacy and the Renaissance. The Fuggers in Augsburg lent to emperors, securing mining rights that made them wealthier than many kingdoms. Behind their ledgers lay principles first tested by Templar treasurers in Jerusalem and Paris, principles preserved not in libraries but in the memory of families chosen to keep them alive. This transformation from warriors to networks changed the very nature of power in Europe. The sword was no longer the ultimate tool of influence. Gold, credit, and knowledge became more decisive than armies. Dynasties rose and fell on the basis of loans, marriages, and silent agreements. And in the shadows of these shifts, one detects the outline of the old order. Not knights charging into battle, but families seated at tables, their seals pressed onto contracts, their silence shaping the fate of empires. Consider the paradox. The Templars were executed for their wealth, their independence, their refusal to be controlled by king or pope. Yet within 2 centuries, the very system they created had become the backbone of European power. Central banks, guild structures, dynastic alliances, all bore the imprint of Templar logic. The order had been destroyed, yet its essence became the architecture of the world that followed. To this day, historians struggle to explain the uncanny continuity. Why certain families seem to emerge with advanced financial systems? Why symbols associated with the Templars reappear in Renaissance art and architecture? Why guilds and secret societies developed rites so reminiscent of the old order? The official records remain silent, but silence itself may be the clue. The circle within the circle had done its work. The bloodline had shifted from the battlefield to the counting house, from the sword to the ledger, from fortresses of stone to fortresses of trust. And so the Templar story did not end in fire. It dissolved into families, resurfaced as guilds, and crystallized into banks. Their treasure was not lost, it was transformed. Their memory was not erased, it was encrypted. What the world believed destroyed in 1307 had in fact become the hidden circulatory system of Europe. A system without banners or battle cries, yet more enduring than any empire of steel. Bloodlines crowned. When the Templars were condemned in 1307, it was said that the Church and the Crown had destroyed them. Yet history reveals a quieter paradox. Within 2 centuries, the very houses that had turned against the order were interwoven with families once tied to its survival. The bloodline that was meant to be erased did not vanish. It became fused with the thrones of Europe. To understand this shift, one must consider the fragile legitimacy of medieval monarchies. Kings ruled by claim of divine right, but legitimacy often required more than a crown. Dynasties needed alliances, financial backing, and sacred ancestry to stabilize their rule. The Templar bloodline, whether through real descent from biblical figures or simply through the perception of carrying an ancient and sacred legitimacy, offered exactly that. What had once been feared as a dangerous inheritance became a coveted foundation for royal continuity. The evidence lies scattered in genealogies. In France, where the persecution had been most brutal, Templar estates and bloodlines quietly filtered into the Bourbon and Orléans branches. Many of these marriages were not celebrated with grand declarations but noted in records of dowries. Lands once belonging to Templar commanderies suddenly transferred to families who rose swiftly in rank. The titles came later, as if recognition had followed legitimacy rather than bestowed it. In England, the story unfolded with equal subtlety. Noble houses such as the Percys, Nevilles, and Howards began to intertwine with Plantagenet, Tudor, and Stuart bloodlines. Many of these families had sheltered Templar survivors or inherited estates abandoned after the order's dissolution. By the 14th century, their descendants were no longer obscure nobles. They were tutors to princes, treasurers of the crown, bishops advising monarchs. They did not need to wear crowns. They stood beside them, often shaping decisions more profoundly than the kings themselves. One recurring clue can be seen in heraldry. Certain royal coats of arms began to display symbols long associated with the Templars: tilted crosses, twin pillars, crescents, and stars. These were not traditional Christian motifs, yet they appeared carved into the stonework of royal chapels, woven into coronation robes, and etched into seals. To the untrained eye, they were decorative flourishes. To those within the circle, they were reminders that blood had been preserved and, with it, the legitimacy of rule. The House of Aragon provides another telling case. In the decades following the Purge, the Aragonese crown absorbed many Templar properties, but it also absorbed something less tangible: alliances with families who had intermarried with the order's hidden bloodlines. By the 15th century, Catalonian nobles with dual heritage, royal on one side, Templar on the other, were serving as court advisors and military commanders. Their children inherited both royal legitimacy and Templar memory, ensuring that the line once condemned by the Vatican now pulsed within Spain's most powerful dynasty. Portugal, too, played a central role. After the order's suppression, it was reconstituted there as the Order of Christ. Many Portuguese royal marriages involved families whose lineage intersected with Templar survivors. As the nation entered its age of exploration, these unions became the bloodline foundation of voyages that redrew the world. Ships that sailed under the Portuguese flag often bore crosses nearly identical to the Templar emblem. Historians call it coincidence. Others see it as continuity in plain sight. The Habsburgs, perhaps the most powerful dynasty in European history, also reveal signs of this hidden inheritance. Their rise from minor Swiss counts to rulers of Austria, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire has long puzzled historians. How did a family of modest origins expand into a dynasty spanning continents? Some suggest their relentless policy of intermarriage, often within narrow circles, was not simply to protect royal blood, but to safeguard something older, something tied to Templar alliances in Languedoc, Provence, and Aragon. In their heraldry, echoes of Templar sigils reappear: the double-headed eagle, the twin cross, the crowned orb. Their archives mention an ordo interior, an inner brotherhood linked to banking circles and noble families from former Templar regions. The persistence of certain surnames across centuries strengthens the argument. Sinclair in Scotland, Gisors in France, d'Albera in Spain, and their equivalents in Italy and Germany. Rarely the centre of dynastic power, yet always present in the margins where influence is most enduring. When traced across genealogical records, these names intersect again and again with royal marriages. Coincidence becomes difficult to accept when the same families reappear beside monarchs in England, France, Spain, Austria, and beyond. The legends of the Merovingian bloodline deepen this intrigue. Said to carry a sacred descent from Christ and Mary Magdalene, or from King David, the Merovingians were deposed in the 8th century, their lineage believed erased. Yet in southern France, in Languedoc, the same region where the Templars once flourished, symbols of Merovingian origin appear alongside Templar emblems. Bees carved into stone, fleur-de-lis woven into tapestries, genealogies annotated with symbols rather than names. If the Templars did indeed seek to preserve a forbidden bloodline, then embedding it into royal houses was the surest way to protect it from extinction. By the Renaissance, the fusion was nearly complete. Dynasties across Europe carried within their veins the silent current of families once tied to the order. No one declared it. No one admitted it. Yet legitimacy seemed to flow naturally toward those lineages, as if an invisible inheritance continued to shape their destiny. Even when monarchies fell, the bloodlines did not disappear. They resurfaced in the form of advisors, bankers, and diplomats. Power shifted from crowns to councils, from thrones to financial houses, but the blood remained. This transition altered the very concept of monarchy. Kingship was no longer just divine right or conquest. It became the visible mask of an invisible continuity, legitimized not only by law, but by lineage. The throne was a seat, but the true foundation lay in the hidden currents that determined who was worthy to sit upon it. In this way, the Templar legacy did not oppose monarchy, it merged with it. What had once been hunted as heresy became the silent pulse of dynasties. Thrones rose and fell, but the bloodline endured, ensuring that the memory of the order was never extinguished. It simply changed form, from fortress to palace, from knight to king, from oath to inheritance. And so the Templar current flowed into the crowns of Europe, not in open rebellion, but in quiet absorption. Not as enemies of the throne, but as its unspoken foundation. What was burned in 1307 survived in marriages, in genealogies, in the symbols etched into royal archives that no historian has fully explained. The Templars may have been erased from law, but in the veins of kings and queens, their memory still lived. The Renaissance, memory in light and stone. The Renaissance is often described as Europe's rebirth, a revival of Greece, of Rome, of classical wisdom, long buried beneath medieval shadows. Yet there is another layer to this story, one seldom written in textbooks. For hidden within the domes, paintings, and manuscripts of that age lie signs of a different inheritance, an inheritance not from Athens or Rome, but from a bloodline once hunted in silence. The memory of the Knights Templar resurfaced, not through banners on the battlefield, but through proportion, symbol, and light. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent waves of Greek manuscripts flooding into Europe, but another stream of knowledge had already been flowing quietly for centuries. Templar survivors and their descendants, absorbed into royal houses and merchant guilds, carried with them fragments of esoteric traditions. Geometry once carved into Rosslyn Chapel, proportions once coded into Templar strongholds, and symbols once whispered in underground rites. These began to find new expression in the art and architecture of the Renaissance. Consider Florence, the beating heart of the New Age. The Medici family, bankers whose wealth financed much of the era's artistic flowering, had connections to Spanish and Portuguese houses long tied to post-Templar networks. Their patronage of artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo was not merely cultural vanity, it was also continuity, an unspoken desire to resurrect symbols in forms too beautiful to be condemned. In the paintings of Botticelli, the geometry of Raphael, and the anatomical sketches of Leonardo, one detects more than art. One detects coded echoes of a legacy that had learned how to survive in silence. Leonardo da Vinci's works provide perhaps the most striking example. His Vitruvian Man, celebrated as a study of human proportion, also reflects the sacred geometry long guarded by mystery schools and, some argue, preserved by the Templars. Circles within squares, ratios that align with ancient Pythagorean principles, echoes of proportions once carved into Templar chapels. His Last Supper arranges disciples not only as figures in a biblical scene, but as a symbolic pattern of triads, mirrors, and hidden geometrical alignments. Scholars argue endlessly over his intent. Yet when one compares his works with the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel, the parallels feel less like coincidence and more like continuation. Rosslyn itself, built in the mid-15th century by the Sinclair family of Scotland, stands as stone testimony to this hidden rebirth. Though presented as a Christian chapel, its carvings reveal a syncretic language of symbols: stars of David, Celtic knots, pagan green men, and botanical forms like maize and aloe, plants unknown in Europe before Columbus. How did such imagery appear in stone decades before the voyages to the New World? One explanation is that descendants of the Templar voyages, perhaps even Henry Sinclair's fabled journey to Nova Scotia in 1398, brought knowledge back, encoded it in stone, and ensured its survival. Rosslyn was not a house of worship. It was an archive, a memory carved in stone, waiting for those with the eyes to see. The Renaissance also witnessed a revival of esoteric traditions long kept in secrecy. Hermeticism, rediscovered through texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, became central to philosophical thought. Alchemy, once whispered in monastic cellars, was now studied openly by scholars and princes. The Kabbalah entered European intellectual circles, its mystical numerology influencing art, architecture, and even statecraft. All of these traditions carried strong parallels to the symbolism preserved by the Templars. When one examines Renaissance lodges, academies, and schools of thought, the structures mirror the old order: inner circles of initiation, coded languages, symbols understood only by the initiated. The cathedrals of the age also bear this mark. Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, hailed as an architectural marvel, was built using proportions aligned with sacred geometry. Sunlight at certain times of the year strikes precise points, echoing designs once seen in Templar chapels. Chartres Cathedral, although earlier, became a model for symbolic alignment. Its rose windows and labyrinth floor patterns reappeared in later Renaissance structures, their geometry preserved not as decoration, but as encrypted knowledge. Even music carried the imprint of memory. Composers experimented with harmonic ratios derived from Pythagorean systems, believing music itself could unlock cosmic order. This idea, that sound and number were linked to divine truth, was not new. It had been preserved by esoteric traditions and whispered in monastic schools, influenced by the Templar legacy. The Renaissance, then, was not a rebirth of forgotten wisdom. It was a reawakening of knowledge carefully kept alive by those who had never forgotten. Royal courts also played their part. The Habsburgs, the Valois, and the Tudors employed advisors steeped in esoteric learning. Astrology, once condemned as superstition, became a tool of governance. Court architects embedded symbols into palaces. Secret councils debated not only politics but also geometry, alchemy, and prophecy. Monarchs needed legitimacy, and legitimacy came not just from power, but from alignment with traditions believed to be ancient and sacred. By merging their dynasties with hidden bloodlines, they claimed not only political authority but also mystical inheritance. Perhaps the most profound shift was the transformation of knowledge itself. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was preserved in cloisters, written in Latin, guarded by the Church. In the Renaissance, it began to flow outward, in paintings, in architecture, in manuscripts translated into vernacular languages. Yet even as it spread, its deeper meanings remained veiled. The public saw beauty, the initiated saw memory. A column was not only a column, it was a pillar of Jachin, or Boaz. A circle was not only a circle, it was eternity inscribed in stone. Light falling at a precise angle was not a coincidence, it was the survival of an oath once sworn beneath Solomon's temple. By the 16th century, Europe was no longer ruled by knights or even kings alone. It was ruled by memory, a memory embedded into symbols so ordinary they could not be erased. The Templar inheritance had found its most brilliant disguise, art, a language no tribunal could condemn, no inquisitor could burn. To admire the paintings of Leonardo, the frescoes of Michelangelo, or the domes of Florence was to admire continuity. And in doing so, millions participated unknowingly in the preservation of something the Vatican had once tried to erase. The Renaissance was celebrated as a human triumph, yet beneath the marble and pigment, beneath the harmony of ratio and light, it was also the quiet victory of bloodlines and networks that had never gone away. The order had been burned, but its essence had risen again, this time hidden in beauty, encrypted in geometry, and sung in the music of an age that believed it was rediscovering antiquity, when in truth it was remembering what had never been forgotten, the rise of financial dynasties. When the swords of the Middle Ages grew silent and the banners of crusading orders faded into memory, a different kind of power began to define Europe. It was no longer measured in castles or armies, but in ledgers, promissory notes, and the invisible movement of wealth. Here, too, the Templar legacy remained, reshaped, disguised, but unmistakably alive. The Knights Templar had been pioneers of financial architecture. By the 12th century, they operated a transcontinental network of commanderies that functioned not only as military outposts but as financial houses. Pilgrims could deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem using coded slips of parchment, an early form of the modern check. Kings and popes borrowed vast sums from them, often mortgaging entire provinces to finance wars. The order's vaults were more trusted than royal treasuries, for the Templars carried the reputation of incorruptibility. When the order was dissolved in 1307, this financial system did not vanish, it fragmented. Treasures disappeared from Paris, account books were burned or hidden. Yet within decades, new families, previously obscure, suddenly wealthy, began to emerge across Europe. Banking houses in Florence, Genoa, and Augsburg rose almost as if on cue, wielding the same instruments the Templars had once mastered. Bills of exchange, long-distance credit networks, coded transaction systems. The Medici of Florence are often celebrated as self-made financiers. Yet their sudden ascendancy coincided with the quiet dispersal of Templar networks from Languedoc and northern Italy. In their ledgers, faint symbols sometimes appeared along the margins, crosses, stars, and spirals, uncannily similar to those etched in Templar manuscripts. Their marriage alliances linked them not only to Florentine guilds, but also to noble houses of Spain and Portugal, regions where Templar refugees had found sanctuary. Whether by inheritance or by absorption, the Medici carried forward not just banking, but memory. In Augsburg, the Fugger family rose in the 15th and 16th centuries to rival kings. They financed emperors, underwrote wars, and brokered papal elections. Their archives reveal methods of secrecy and coded record-keeping remarkably similar to Templar treasury systems. The Fuggers dealt in copper, silver, and credit across Europe, operating with a precision that suggested more than mere innovation. Some independent historians suggest their earliest capital may have originated from hidden Templar hoards transferred through merchant intermediaries. Further north, the Welsers and other merchant bankers followed similar paths. Families with no long record of nobility suddenly acquired vast estates, titles, and influence, almost as though propelled by an unseen hand. In every case, the pattern was consistent: controlled marriages, secret archives, symbols carved discreetly into ledgers and architectural facades, alliances with courts that had once condemned the Templars, yet now depended on their descendants. Perhaps the most striking continuity appears in Basel, Switzerland. After the suppression of the order, Basel became a discreet hub of surviving Templar influence. Centuries later, it would house the Bank for International Settlements, the so-called central bank of central banks. The city's financial institutions carried forward traditions of secrecy, dual-key vault systems, and layered governance eerily reminiscent of Templar treasuries. Even today, Basel's architecture reflects ratios and proportions once central to sacred geometry, as if memory had been laid into the very stones of the city. Portugal provides another thread in this tapestry. There, the Templars were officially transformed into the Order of Christ, with papal approval. Their estates, wealth, and networks remained intact, only renamed. Under this new banner, the order became central to Portugal's age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, himself Grand Master of the Order of Christ, used its resources to fund voyages along the African coast and eventually across the Atlantic. The ships bore sails marked with the Red Cross, a symbol that had once belonged to knights but now adorned explorers. What was once military became maritime. What was once crusade became navigation. The wealth generated from these voyages flowed back into royal coffers, entwining Templar-descended networks with global trade. In Spain, a parallel story unfolded. After the Reconquista, many noble families with suspected Templar ties became patrons of exploration and finance. Their descendants stood behind Columbus, Cortés, and the vast enterprises of the New World. In their contracts and charters, scholars note peculiar clauses regarding inheritance and guardianship, arrangements designed less for open profit than for long-term preservation. As with the Templar vow, the objective was never immediate gain. It was endurance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, a new dynasty emerged that would inherit this architecture most fully: the Rothschilds. Official history tells of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, a coin dealer in Frankfurt, who built a banking empire by sending his 5 sons to the capitals of Europe. Yet the mystery lies in the initial capital that allowed such expansion. No royal patronage has been documented. No sudden inheritance has been traced. Instead, the Rothschilds seem to tap into a pre-existing current, acquiring rare manuscripts, coin collections, and esoteric symbols suggestive of older traditions. Their family crest, 5 arrows representing 5 sons, bears an uncanny resemblance to diagrams in Templar cryptography, where 5 paths represented the safe havens established after 1307. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the Rothschilds became indispensable to Europe's political order, not as kings or generals, but as guarantors of financial stability. They refinanced monarchies, underwrote national debts, and ensured that no great power could move without passing through their network. Here was the Templar lesson perfected. To control the flow of wealth was to control history itself. What unites all these families, the Medici, the Fuggers, the Welsers, the Rothschilds, is not just wealth, but structure. Their marriages were controlled, often kept within closed circles. Their archives were secret, sometimes coded, never fully disclosed. Their influence was never proclaimed, only exercised. In this way, they mirrored the Templar tradition, silent, discreet, enduring. Symbols continued to reappear. The Red Cross transformed into trade logos. The twin pillars resurfaced in architectural motifs of banks. The unfinished pyramid and all-seeing eye emerged on seals and currencies. Officially, these were decorative. To those familiar with esoteric traditions, they were reminders that memory had not died. By the dawn of the modern age, the Templar inheritance had shifted entirely from battlefield to balance sheet. No longer knights, their descendants were bankers. No longer defending fortresses, they defended credit. The legacy had become invisible, yet far more powerful. For while castles can be stormed and thrones toppled, debt endures, interest accumulates, and financial memory survives every revolution. Thus, the bloodline, once hunted by kings, became the invisible architecture behind kingdoms. What fire could not destroy ledgers preserved, and in the silent arithmetic of promissory notes and compound interest, the Templar legacy found its most enduring disguise, an empire of wealth without borders, ruling not by decree but by design. Secret societies, the architecture of hidden memory. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The Middle Ages of knights and crusades had given way to nation-states, revolutions, and the birth of modern science. Yet beneath this surface of change, the current of hidden bloodlines continued to flow. No longer dressed in armor or cloaked in the robes of monastic orders, they now appeared in salons, lodges, academies, and secret societies. These were the new sanctuaries, places where ancient memory could survive, hidden in ritual, symbol, and oath. Freemasonry was among the first of these structures to crystallize. Its origins are still debated. Some trace it to medieval stonemason guilds, others to Renaissance humanist circles. But the deeper one looks into its symbols, hierarchies, and initiatory practices. The more its kinship with the Templar inheritance becomes apparent. The compass and square, the twin pillars of Jachin and Boaz, the all-seeing eye, the blazing star, and these were not inventions of the Enlightenment. They were echoes of a symbolic language older than the cathedrals themselves, carried forward in stone, preserved in blood. Scotland provided fertile ground for this continuation. After 1307, when the Templars were hunted in France, Scotland became a refuge. Families like the Sinclairs, guardians of Rosslyn Chapel, sheltered survivors and preserved their legacy. It was in Scotland that the earliest Masonic lodges began to appear, often in places where Templar influence had once been strongest. The rituals of Freemasonry, with their 3 degrees of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master, mirror the tiered initiations once practiced in Templar inner circles. The language of secrecy, the handshakes, the coded gestures, all traceable not to medieval builders alone, but to a brotherhood that had once been burned for holding knowledge too dangerous for its age. By the 18th century, another group emerged, the Illuminati, founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt in Ingolstadt, Bavaria. Outwardly, it presented itself as a society of reason, opposing tyranny, superstition, and clerical power. Yet its inner structure bore a striking resemblance to Templar and Masonic systems: degrees of initiation, coded correspondence, inner and outer circles, esoteric teachings reserved only for the higher ranks. Its members were not merely academics and reformers. Many carried surnames linked to banking dynasties and noble houses that had once sheltered Templar descendants. To the public, the Illuminati represented radical modernity. To those who looked deeper, it was memory reborn under the language of reason. Historians have long debated whether the Illuminati truly held great influence, or whether it was dismantled shortly after its founding, but its symbols and methods survived, absorbed into Masonic lodges, revolutionary movements, and later into the very architecture of modern states. What is undeniable is the overlap. Families once tied to post-Templar networks reappeared in both Freemasonry and Illuminati circles, their influence stretching across courts, banks, and universities. The French Revolution offers a telling example. While it is remembered as a popular uprising against monarchy and privilege, many of its leaders were Freemasons. Lodges in Paris and Lyon became forums not only for political debate, but also for the transmission of symbolic memory. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, with its emphasis on universal brotherhood, equality, and enlightenment, reflects ideals long preserved in esoteric traditions. At the same time, revolutionary symbols, the eye, the triangle, the unfinished pyramid, were drawn not from peasant banners but from Masonic iconography. In America, the pattern repeated. Many of the founding fathers, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, were Freemasons. The cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol was laid in a Masonic ritual. The Great Seal of the United States, with its pyramid and all-seeing eye, is often dismissed as coincidence. Yet its geometry aligns with Kabbalistic principles once preserved in Templar manuscripts, later transmitted through Masonic lodges. The language of democracy may have been new, but the architecture of its symbols was very old. Secret societies served another purpose as well. They provided safe havens for bloodlines that could not declare themselves. Within lodges and brotherhoods, marriages were arranged, alliances forged, genealogies preserved. Not every member was of the blood, but those who were recognized one another through symbol and ritual. These societies became the new vessels of continuity, where ancient memory was preserved not through public proclamation, but through private ceremony. Beyond Freemasonry and the Illuminati, other orders flourished. The Rosicrucians emerged in the early 17th century, publishing manifestos that blended mysticism, alchemy, and reformist ideals. While often dismissed as literary inventions, Rosicrucian traditions carried clear echoes of esoteric Christianity and Templar gnosis. The Order of the Golden Dawn in the 19th century revived many of these symbols, fusing Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and ritual magic. In every case, the pattern was the same. An inner circle of initiates, a language of symbol, and a memory of continuity that stretched back to those who had once sworn oaths beneath Solomon's temple. By the 19th and 20th centuries, these societies intersected with politics and finance in increasingly visible ways. Masons held high offices in parliaments and cabinets. Banking dynasties interwove with esoteric orders. Even revolutions that claimed to overthrow old systems often left the deeper architecture intact. Bloodlines adapted, but they did not disappear. The question is not whether these societies were mere clubs or whether they secretly ruled the world. The question is whether they served as vessels, structures through which memory could flow across centuries. When one compares the rituals of Freemasonry with Templar initiation oaths, the encrypted writings of the Illuminati with Templar ciphers, the symbolism of the Rosicrucians with the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel, a pattern emerges. These were not new inventions, they were transmissions, fragments of a legacy too dangerous to be public, too enduring to be destroyed. In the end, secret societies were not about secrecy alone, they were about survival. By dispersing memory across lodges, across countries, across symbols carved into architecture and printed on currency, the bloodline ensured it could never again be erased by a single decree or a single fire. It had learned from the purge of 1307. Never again would all the memory be in one place. From now on, it would live in networks, in rituals, in families that no one could fully trace. And so while Europe marched into the modern age, it did so guided by symbols older than its revolutions, and by a memory that had been reborn in the quiet sanctuaries of secret brotherhoods. The bloodline across the seas. When the Middle Ages closed, Europe was restless. Kingdoms were exhausted by war, populations were hungry for wealth, and new horizons beckoned. But behind the ships, the maps, and the explorers lay something deeper than the hunger for gold or glory. The age of exploration was not only about trade and conquest, It was about memory, memory carried across the oceans by bloodlines that had learned to move quietly, disguised as merchants, navigators, and king's advisors. Portugal became the first stage of this transformation. After the suppression of the Templars in 1307, King Denis of Portugal refused to annihilate the order. Instead, he absorbed it into a new structure, the Order of Christ. The same lands, the same castles, the same financial networks all remained intact. Only the name had changed, and with this shift, the Templar legacy gained a new disguise, not crusaders, but explorers. Prince Henry the Navigator, often hailed as the architect of Portugal's maritime empire, was Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his patronage, voyages began down the coast of Africa, carrying with them not just the cross on their sails, but also the accumulated knowledge of Templar cartographers, navigators, and financiers. The red cross that once adorned white cloaks now spread across the oceans on the sails of caravels. What had once marched into Jerusalem now sailed into the unknown. The knowledge carried by these voyages was peculiar. Maps appeared that seemed too accurate for their time, depicting coastlines not yet discovered. The Piri Reis map of 1513, a Turkish chart partly based on earlier sources, showed parts of South America and even Antarctica with uncanny precision. Scholars still debate how such detail could exist before official exploration. Some suggest ancient knowledge passed through Byzantine hands. Others whisper of Templar charts preserved in secret archives, carried westward when survival demanded exile. Spain, too, bore traces of this legacy. After the Reconquista, noble families in Aragon and Castile that had once sheltered Templars became patrons of overseas expansion. When Columbus set sail in 1492, his ships bore crosses almost identical to those used by the Order of Christ. Financial support came from families whose genealogies linked back to those who had quietly absorbed Templar memory. Some of Columbus's contemporaries even hinted that his voyage was less discovery and more unveiling, a journey guided by maps and knowledge preserved from an age long before. Legends of Templar voyages westward before Columbus still persist. In Scotland, the Sinclair family, guardians of Rosslyn Chapel, are said to have sailed to Nova Scotia in 1398, nearly a century earlier. Oral traditions among the Mi'kmaq people speak of pale-skinned men in robes bearing symbols of light who came not to conquer, but to exchange knowledge. Stone carvings and geometric patterns in the region bear a resemblance to Templar codes found in Europe. Mainstream historians dismiss these claims as myth, yet the details refuse to fade. Whether these voyages truly occurred or not, what matters is that the memory survived. The Templar tradition of secrecy had evolved, not to record everything, but to preserve only what needed to be remembered. And so in carvings, in oral stories, in symbols passed across the sea, fragments of the legacy resurfaced in unexpected places. The age of exploration also revealed another continuity, the merging of bloodline and empire. Portuguese and Spanish royals married into families long suspected of carrying Templar memory. Their children did not fight battles in Europe alone. They became governors, viceroys, and missionaries overseas. The Red Cross of the Crusades became the Red Cross of Empire. The vow once sworn at Solomon's Temple became the silent duty to carry memory into lands where no pope or king could erase it. In South America, Jesuit missions became centers of education, astronomy, and geometry. Their architecture bore the marks of sacred proportions, long familiar to Templar builders. Churches in Paraguay and Brazil display carvings of twin pillars, solar alignments, and symbols of hidden light. Outwardly Catholic, inwardly coded. In these missions, bloodlines continued their guardianship not through swords but through schools, teaching selected knowledge to selected heirs. Further north, in the emerging colonies of North America, Masonic lodges became the vessels of memory. By the 17th century, Freemasonry had crossed the Atlantic, carried by merchants, explorers, and settlers. The first lodges in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston became meeting places for men who would one day lead a revolution. Their rituals, their symbols, their oaths all bore echoes of the same traditions once sworn in underground Templar chambers. Rosslyn Chapel again appears as a silent witness in this story. Built in the 15th century, it contains carvings of maize and aloe plants, species unknown in Europe until after Columbus's voyages. How these images came to be there remains unexplained. Some suggest traders carried seeds earlier than official history records. Others believe Sinclair voyages brought knowledge across the Atlantic long before Spain claimed discovery. Whatever the truth, the chapel stands as stone testimony to a memory older than official timelines, encoded in symbols that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The age of exploration was also the age of secrecy. Royal charters, colonial monopolies, and papal bulls all cloaked deeper arrangements. Genealogies were carefully guarded, alliances concealed, records redacted. Families with no apparent history suddenly controlled vast estates in the New World. Others, seemingly minor nobles, appeared as financiers of entire fleets. In many cases, their names trace back to regions once filled with Templar commanderies: Languedoc, Aragon, Portugal, and Scotland. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. By the 18th century, the New World had become more than colonies. It had become a stage for the continuation of ancient memory. The founding of the United States itself carried Masonic imprints at every step. The layout of Washington, D.C., designed with sacred geometry, the Great Seal echoing esoteric symbols, the oath of office resembling ancient vows. Behind the visible architecture of a new republic lay the invisible architecture of memory, bloodlines, lodges, and councils whose roots reached back to Jerusalem's crypts. Thus, the age of exploration was not only about gold, silver, and spice. It was about transplantation. The memory once guarded in castles and monasteries now crossed oceans, embedded itself in colonies, and reappeared in the very structures of new nations. The vow had survived the fire of 1307. It had survived exile in Scotland, secrecy in lodges, transformation into finance. Now it survived across the sea, written not in chronicles, but in the silent patterns of geography, architecture, and bloodline. The Templars had once been accused of worshipping a hidden head, a secret presence no one could name. Perhaps what they truly guarded was not an idol, but an axis, a center of continuity that no king or pope could destroy. And by the time the sails of Columbus, Cabral, and Magellan crossed the oceans, that axis had already shifted. The bloodline was no longer confined to Europe. It now lived in the New World, scattered like seeds, invisible but enduring, waiting for history to catch up. Thrones of blood and memory. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was no longer the fractured world of crusades and monasteries. It had become a theatre of dynasties, vast families weaving their power across kingdoms, binding nations through marriage and sealing their authority not only in treaties, but in blood. And behind the thrones there was always something deeper. Genealogies that quietly carried the pulse of memory, stretching back to a time when knights knelt beneath the vaults of Solomon's temple. The House of Habsburg stands as one of the clearest examples of this silent inheritance. Emerging from relatively modest origins in Switzerland, the Habsburgs rose to dominate Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, and eventually the Holy Roman Empire. Their heraldry bore the double-headed eagle, an ancient symbol of dual sovereignty, earthly and divine, and one strikingly similar to signs preserved in Templar seals. Scholars have long argued that the Habsburg rise was engineered not merely by territorial conquest, but by carefully orchestrated marriages into families that had once sheltered Templar descendants. In archival fragments from Languedoc and Provence, regions that were strongholds of the Templars before 1307, names appear that later resurface in Habsburg marriage alliances. The overlap is not accidental. These unions were not simply about land or dowries, they were about preservation. By merging with dynasties that carried legitimacy, wealth, and memory, the Habsburgs built a lineage that was more than royal, it was symbolic. Their much-discussed practice of intermarriage, often criticized as obsession or genetic error, may have been something else entirely. A strategy to ensure that their bloodline remained undiluted, preserving what they believed was sacred continuity. The Bourbons of France carried a similar thread. Rising to the throne in the 16th century, they traced side branches that linked back to nobles who had quietly supported the Templars during their persecution. Estates once belonging to Templar commanderies somehow ended in Bourbon hands, transfers not fully explained by legal records. Heraldic devices, crescent moons, tilted crosses, and stylized lilies echoed symbols once carved in Templar chapels. And within the French monarchy, advisors, bishops, and treasurers often came from families that genealogists identify as silent inheritors of the post-Templar network. England too bore marks of this hidden legacy. After the purge of 1307, many Templars fled across the Channel, where the crackdown was far less severe. They melted into noble houses of Norman origin, Percy, Neville, Howard, families that would later appear again and again in the margins of English royal power. By the time of the Tudors and the Stuarts, marriages between these nobles and royal branches had woven Templar blood into the English crown. The Plantagenets, whose dynasty overlapped with the Templars' greatest years, had long ties to the order through patronage and finance. Later, their descendants merged with the Tudors and then the House of Stuart. Even the present British monarchy carries curious echoes. The House of Windsor, formerly Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, descends through a web of German, Austrian, and Scottish lineages. Traced back far enough, these lines intersect with families from Aquitaine, Normandy, and Languedoc, precisely the regions where Templar networks were once strongest. Symbols persist as well: the crescent in Prince William's heraldry, the double-barred cross in older coats of arms, and even Balmoral Castle's location, not far from ancient Templar refuges. Each detail alone might be dismissed. Seen together, they suggest continuity, memory woven into monarchy. What unites these dynasties is not simply political power, but a subtle choreography of genealogy. Royal marriages were rarely accidents. They were strategies of bloodline preservation. In sealed genealogical records kept in monasteries and private archives, certain unions are marked not with names but with symbols, circles, slashes, or stars. Scholars who have glimpsed these documents suggest they were codes indicating bloodline keepers, descendants chosen not merely for rule, but for remembrance. The Jesuits too played a role in this dynastic web. Founded in 1540, the Society of Jesus became advisors, confessors, and educators to kings and princes across Europe. Many of its leaders came from noble families with Templar connections. In their schools, royal heirs were instructed not only in theology and politics, but also in geometry, symbolism, and memory systems that bore uncanny resemblance to earlier esoteric traditions. Outwardly loyal to the Vatican, the Jesuits quietly functioned as a bridge between ancient vows and modern thrones. Symbols tell the story where documents cannot. In Habsburg palaces, the double-headed eagle appears beside geometries aligning with Kabbalistic principles. In Bourbon estates, stained glass windows align with solar cycles once honored in Templar chapels. In England, coronation rituals preserve gestures that mirror Masonic and even Templar rites, the anointing of the monarch, the placement of hands, the oath sworn over sacred text. These continuities may be explained as tradition, but tradition itself may be the cloak of memory. Financial continuity was equally crucial. Dynasties could not endure on bloodline alone. They required networks of capital, credit, and trade. Here again, post-Templar families provided the infrastructure. The Fuggers of Augsburg, the Medici of Florence, the Welses of Germany all rose to prominence in the very regions where Templars once managed treasure and trade. Their intermarriage with Habsburg and Bourbon branches ensured that capital and blood moved together, inseparable currents of power. By the 18th century, European monarchy was more than hereditary rule. It had become a lattice of interconnected lineages, a network so dense that nearly every royal house shared ancestry within just a few generations. This was not coincidence. It was design, a design ensuring that, regardless of revolution or war, the pulse of memory, bloodline memory, would survive. Even revolutions could not erase it. The French Revolution guillotined Bourbon kings, but their side branches survived in exile, marrying into other noble families and resurfacing in later politics. The English Civil War executed Charles I, but the Stuart line continued abroad, returning generations later in altered form. The Habsburg Empire collapsed in the 20th century, yet its blood remained scattered through European and global aristocracy. The crown may fall, but blood never leaves the stage. In this way, dynasties became less about crowns than about guardianship. Behind the visible power of monarchy lay a deeper purpose, the preservation of memory carried through veins rather than decrees. This is why genealogical gaps exist, why certain marriages were concealed, why archives remain sealed for centuries. What is being guarded is not simply royal legitimacy. It is a current too ancient to be explained, too central to be risked in public light. Thus, the modern empires of Habsburg, Bourbon, and Windsor were not just thrones of politics. They were thrones of blood and memory, pillars of continuity through which the ancient vow still echoed. A vow sworn not in public, but in shadows, not to rule for themselves, but to ensure that something older than kingship would never be forgotten. The silent axis of power. History often tells us that empires fall, dynasties end, and revolutions sweep away the old to make room for the new. Yet beneath these dramatic changes lies a quieter current. It does not dissolve when crowns are toppled, nor does it vanish when constitutions are written. It persists, invisible yet enduring, carried not in titles but in memory, not in fortresses but in families, not in armies but in the bloodlines that have learned how to move unseen. The Knights Templar were burned in the fires of 1307, accused of heresy, secrecy, and dangerous power. Officially, they vanished. But the more carefully one traces the centuries that followed, the more one sees that their disappearance may have been only a surface illusion. Beneath the flames, something survived, adapted, migrated, and found new forms. A hidden continuity that never needed a name to endure. In finance, it survived as the architecture of trust and credit. What began as pilgrim deposits in the 12th century evolved into a network of family banks, then into central banks, and now into institutions that decide the value of currencies across the world. The Templars once invented promissory notes to allow a pilgrim to withdraw funds in Jerusalem after depositing them in Paris. Today, central banks and global markets operate on principles no less abstract, no less dependent on faith. And many of the families who guided this shift, Fugger, Medici, Rothschild, trace their presence back to the very regions where the Templar network once held sway. In monarchy, it survived as carefully arranged marriages, sealed genealogies, and symbols carried through coats of arms. The Habsburg eagle, the Bourbon lilies, the Windsor crescents, all traceable to ancient symbols of dual power, divine legitimacy, and sacred blood. Crowns may have changed, parliaments risen, nations redrawn, but the bloodlines themselves remained, quiet foundations beneath visible thrones. In secret societies, it survived as ritual and structure. The Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Jesuits, each carried echoes of Templar organization, tiered initiation, coded language, inner circles of knowledge. Their meetings, their symbols, their silence became vessels for memory, allowing continuity without exposure. To this day, Masonic lodges across the world preserve rituals that mirror ceremonies first whispered in candle-lit crypts beneath Solomon's temple. In exploration, it survived as hidden maps and coded carvings. The Order of Christ in Portugal launched voyages that redrew the world, their sails marked with the red cross once worn in Jerusalem. Rosslyn Chapel's carvings of maize and aloe stand as stone witnesses to a knowledge that crossed the Atlantic before official history admits. And in the founding symbols of the United States, the all-seeing eye, the unfinished pyramid, the ritual oath of office, the traces of a much older architecture remain, hidden in plain sight. In culture, it survived as geometry, proportion, and encoded art. The Renaissance masters, Leonardo, Raphael, Botticelli, wove into their paintings proportions and symbols long preserved in Templar and esoteric diagrams. Cathedrals, palaces, and even modern parliaments follow patterns that echo sacred geometry, twin pillars, solar alignments, golden ratios. Buildings are no longer just structures, they are manuscripts in stone, silent libraries for those who know how to read. And in the modern age, it survives in places we rarely look, not in battlefields, but in boardrooms, not in castles, but in foundations, global summits where unelected families and dynasties meet, charitable organizations whose structures echo secret orders, investment trusts whose ownership vanishes behind layers of holding companies, yet whose influence spans continents, tech corporations building algorithms that shape not only markets, but thought itself. At every step, the same pattern repeats. Visible leaders change, but beneath them, the axis of influence remains the same. It may no longer be called a bloodline in the literal sense. It may now be something broader, an ecosystem of families, symbols, and memories linked across centuries. Yet the logic is unchanged. The treasure was never just gold. The true treasure was legitimacy, knowledge, and the quiet continuity of power through time. Some researchers call it coincidence, others call it conspiracy. But perhaps it is something older still, design, a design that ensures memory never dies even when history pretends it has, a design that allows silence to become strength, invisibility to become protection, and exile to become rebirth. The question is no longer whether the Templars survived. The question is whether the world has ever truly escaped them. For when we look at the hidden genealogies, the recurring symbols, the invisible networks of finance, media, and governance, a possibility emerges. That we live not in a world of spontaneous history, but in one carefully steered across centuries by those who chose silence over exposure, continuity over conquest, and legacy over name. What makes this thought so difficult is its subtlety. There is no central fortress to storm, no king to overthrow, no single society to expose. The axis of power is not visible because it does not need to be. It exists in the way the world is structured, in the flow of capital, the rules of governance, the design of symbols, the quiet rituals no one questions. It exists in the choices already made before they reach the surface. And so when you look at today's world, its nations, its leaders, its institutions, ask not who rules, but who cannot be removed. Ask not what laws are written, but who decides which laws may be considered. Ask not which histories are told, but who decides what is forgotten. These questions do not have easy answers, but in asking them one begins to sense the outline of something older, something that has outlived fire, revolution, and even time. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Templars, not that they were warriors, or bankers, or heretics, but that they discovered a way to endure where all others fell. By becoming the hidden layer beneath history, they ensured that their memory could never again be burned away. And if that is true, then tonight, as the world sleeps under the illusion of its own freedom, somewhere the silent axis still turns. No names, no titles, no declarations, only continuity, only memory, only the echo of an oath first spoken in darkness beneath the stones of a temple long vanished, not destroyed, only waiting